Microbrands and independent watchmakers. They're two very unique kind of groups. And the thing that they share is that they're not involved with any of the large corporate structures like Swatch Group, LVMH, Richemont Group. They're separate. But from there, the lines kind of get fuzzy. A lot of times I'm asked if I think Weiss is a microbrand or an independent. And I believe that we're an independent, and I'll go a little bit more into detail on that. But first off, I want to say that it's a personal opinion as to what the difference between a microbrand and an independent is. So if you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them in the comments, because I'm interested in this. This is what I live day in, day out, independent watchmaking. And I'm an enthusiast, so I love to follow microbrands, and I also love to follow the larger corporate brands. Now, I don't think that any of these one groups would be considered better than or worse than. I love all watches, whether it comes from an independent, a microbrand, or a larger watchmaking group, or even a luxury group that involves companies that are outside of watchmaking. I've worked for an independent, which is Audemars Piguet, and I've also worked for a large group, the Richemont Group, and Vacheron Constantin. There are clear differences when you're working for these companies, but from the outside looking in as a consumer or just a lover of watches, it's not as clear. Being in the US, we are really in tune with something that is relatively new in the watch world. And that is this growth of the microbrand. And the reason I think that microbrands in the USA have become such a big part of the market is because in the US, we have very little watchmaking infrastructure. My personal opinion is that the microbrand is not just a small company, it is a new intro into watchmaking. And it's not necessarily something that has to exist for more than just one watch, right? I believe a microbrand could create one watch and then be done. And that could be great. It could be an amazing watch. It could be an amazing value with an amazing story. But it might not be around for the long term. So for me, I see the difference between a microbrand and an independent being that a microbrand will utilize existing structures elsewhere. Maybe just having one person kind of leading the charge to design and create a watch, or possibly a few watches, a line of watches, but not necessarily having any watchmakers on staff, designers on staff, or maybe not even having any inventory. Could possibly be a Kickstarter where a certain design that was created can be sold on Kickstarter, and there doesn't have to be any investment either. And I think this is a really cool opportunity that we have with this new Kickstarter technology, or now it's not new, but in the world of watchmaking, it is relatively new. But it allows more people to get involved in watchmaking without having to go to a watchmaking school or go work for a watchmaker selling watches to then work up the ladder to maybe designing watches. These sorts of things allow for an individual to jump into the watch world and get into the industry with next to no investment, just a little bit of time. Now, a microbrand can very well turn into an independent and may even make that jump into the corporate world and be purchased by a larger group. So I don't think there is a category that a brand enters and then remains there forever. There's always movement. Vacheron was at one time an independent, and Audemars may at some point join one of the larger groups. When I first started Weiss, I would say that we were a microbrand. I started the business in my apartment. I was working for Vacheron Constantin at the time, and I had a small home workshop, but I just made one watch with one dial color and one strap option. And I could have at that time decided that that was the only watch I would produce, and that would be the end of it. Instead, I wanted to build it into something else, and eventually I think we transferred into the independent category, where we now have a large workshop. I can service and repair any watches I've made, and we also manufacture components. So I definitely think that there is room for a brand to move around and not necessarily be stuck in one of those positions. But I also don't believe that either one of those positions is less than the other. I think having all of this extra interest in watches over the past 20 years has actually opened up the market for more people to join. So we have a lot more smaller brands, which is wonderful because we end up with a lot more unique brand identities and unique product offerings. Some at extremely reasonable prices. Others might be so rare that they could be quite expensive. But all of it leads to a much more interesting watchmaking industry and a much more interesting landscape for watch enthusiasts and watch collectors. If you walk into most watch retailers, you'll find that most of the brands that are on the shelves are owned by just 2 to 3 different companies. And this can be kind of boring. It doesn't always allow for the most creativity. So having independents and microbrands mixed in there makes things a lot more interesting. However, without those large corporate structures that were willing to purchase these brands and their history and employ all of the watchmakers in Switzerland and other parts of the world, the industry would have fizzled and disappeared. So we owe a lot to these big companies like Swatch Group, Richemont, LVMH, and there's a few others that own a lot of smaller brands as well. But from those brands, they hold a lot of the knowledge and history of watchmaking, and they kept it alive. The big brands are also able to invest a lot in research and development. So they also have the ability to push watchmaking forward with things like silicone hairsprings, ceramic cases. There's a lot of new material developments and engineering developments that we owe to big brands. There's something called the coaxial escapement that was developed by George Daniels. And George Daniels was one of the greatest watchmakers in the recent past. He made very few watches in his lifetime. He was an independent, but he will be remembered by all of the Omega coaxial escapement watches that are sold today. His DNA is in that watch, and there are millions of them now, thanks to Omega and the Swatch Group. So the lines definitely become blurry as to what is independent and what is part of a giant group. And both parties are necessary in order to make watchmaking more interesting. Microbrands and independents also rely heavily on brands that are owned by larger companies. The Swatch Group owns Incablock, and I use Incablock shock protection in every single watch that we make. The Swatch Group also owns ETA, and we use parts from ETA. Along with many other independents and microbrands, we rely heavily on their infrastructure that they had the foresight to purchase when everyone else was trying to run away from mechanical watches because of the quartz crisis. So I am a firm believer that without large groups like the Swatch Group and people like Nicholas Hayek, who was the CEO of the Swatch Group and was a large part of the formation of that group of companies, the microbrand and independent sectors of watchmaking would not be able to exist today without those people and those large groups. They are the ones that saved watchmaking, saved mechanical watchmaking. Over my time in the industry, I've kind of developed my own thought of what it means to be a microbrand and what it means to be an independent. And I believe that an independent will have the ability to service their watches after they sell them. I also think that an independent will have more invested in their brand and company, meaning offices, employees, knowledge, tools, things like that. A microbrand could be simply one person at home designing a watch to be made in a factory on the other side of the world. The coolest part about being in the watch industry today is that it is completely possible to have a day job and start a watch company, to create a brand. There's this relatively accessible path to move into microbrands, and then, if things get serious, to move into independent watchmaking, and possibly even sell to a group. There are a lot of opportunities in the watch industry, and a lot of different tiers and levels for any different kind of brand.